mode here. It's one of those days, I think, which Roger pointed out, it's Friday the 13th. So yeah, we'll take it as it is. So welcome and thank you for joining us today with when we postponed this. And I'm always glad that I can see folks stick with us and follow along. But I wanted to let everybody know we do have ISA credits and SAF credits. And like always, I will put a survey link in the chat box at the end of the session. And all you have to do is access that survey, put your numbers in, and we will submit those to national. Let me get this off my screen. Just a quick update. So I've listed some upcoming programs here for us in the new year. There's more coming, and we're working on meeting with some folks to get some other dates on the calendar. But this is what's there. The February 18th one, you can see it says info coming. There's been emails back and forth today to try to solidify that one. Difference between the 8th and the 18th is the 8th is just a couple hour intro to winter tree ID, and the 18th will be an all-day in-depth winter tree ID class. As I said, with info coming, you'll always be able to find the information at woodlandstewards.osu.edu. So before we get started, just remember that we will answer questions at the end of the session, and we ask that you put them in the Q&A box. We'll try to monitor the chat box, but it's a whole lot easier if everybody just puts their questions in the Q&A, and then we can tackle those at the end of the presentations. It will be recorded for today, and we'll get that posted as soon as everything processes. And so, unless there's something I forgot, everybody, we'll get started. And so today we're going to talk about carbon markets. And it's a topic that comes up quite frequently anymore with a lot of questions. So hopefully we can answer some of those today. We have a huge panel for us. Typically you get one speaker, maybe two. Today you get a whole host of folks to try to answer all these questions and give you the information that you need. We're going to start off with Roger Williams and Brent Sohngen, and then Tammy and Stephanie, and hopefully Becca will be here at the end of the session. So Roger Williams is with Ohio State. He is one of our forestry faculty in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. Brent Sohngen is, oh dear, it's AEDE, but Brent, you're going to have to spell that out because I never remember what it is, but is also a faculty member in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Science. Jeezy, it is Friday the 13th. But we're going to let them get started, and I'll apologize to Brent that I didn't write out AEDE so I would remember what it means. He'll get me for it later. So with that, let me get out of this. And Roger and Beck is on, so.
Okay. All right. I guess everybody can see that screen.
You're good.
Okay. All right. So as we begin, and thank you, Kathy, before we really get into the whole aspect of carbon markets, there's just a few things to think about as we go into this discussion. I got to get things working here. There we go. Oh, all right. So first of all, probably everyone knows not all forests are created equal, right? And when we look at, the amount of carbon that's sequestered and stored in a forest is going to be determined by many things. Four of those is certainly going to be forest composition. And we know that some tree species have the ability to store more carbon than others. It's based on wood density. Also, when we're looking at different growth rates of species, they sequester carbon faster than those that grow slow. And then forest density, of course, obviously how many trees you have out there on an acre is going to be determining what how much carbon you've got out there. And then forest age. One of the things that we know is that the sequestration rates of forests are much faster when the forests are young compared to when they are old. They tend to peak, the sequestration rates tend to peak at early ages. Um, and then they eventually get to a type of equilibrium when they get older, because obviously you get carbon losses from decomposition of organic material, death of trees, and so forth. And then forest growth. The faster a forest grows, the faster the carbon sequestration. So there's going to be a lot of different things that are going to determine how much carbon is stored in your forest and how quickly that carbon gets stored. Now, in terms of types of forest carbon projects, there's reforestation or afforestation type of projects. And that's particularly on it when you're reforesting areas that previously had not been forested. Avoided conversion, and those are projects where where forests are under stress in terms of being converted to some other land use. And if you can prove that that forest could easily be converted to some other land use, but you keep it into a forest, could also serve as a project. And then, of course, improve forest management, where you apply different management techniques to improve the growth and health of your forest. And most forest carbon projects will enter into the voluntary carbon market. And when we talk about voluntary carbon markets, this is where doing a carbon project, obviously with forests, it's optional. There's no mandatory, there's no obligations by law to do that. It's voluntary, and therefore it goes into a voluntary carbon market. And when we look at the voluntary carbon markets, mostly those are going to be considering the improved forest management type of projects. Now, just basically just a quick skinny on how this works, right? You've got your forest here where that is sequestering and storing carbon. And these carbon programs, and I'll just allude to that in just a second. These programs give you the ability to monitor the carbon that's being sequestered and stored. It's being quantified, okay? And then the carbon registry, that is where that turns your offsets that you produce in your forest into marketable carbon credits. And then greenhouse gas emitters, whatever that might be, whoever that might be, then will purchase those credits that you have produced as a result of the offsets in your forest. Okay, they will purchase those credits. Those credits have monetary value. And then when the greenhouse gas emitter purchases those credits, then that money that is paid by the emitter then gets transferred back to the landowner. Okay, so the carbon offsets, the carbon project there on the left of the screen, that's going to be developed with a carbon program, and I'll allude to that in just a second here. But the carbon program determines, they go with the standards set forth by the carbon registry, and they have very specific methodologies on determining how much carbon is stored in your forest, what the rate of carbon storage is occurring in your forest. And those then are recognized by the carbon registry that can turn those offsets into credits. So there is a variety of forest carbon programs. I've got some listed here: the Natural Capital Exchange, the Family Forest Carbon Program, Forest Carbon Works, Blue Source, and Land Yield. These are entities that work with landowners to develop those projects to quantify the amount of carbon stored in those in the forests and the rate of carbon change or being sequestered through time. So you have to, obviously, one of the things you have to look at is the differences of those forest carbon programs. They're not all the same. They have different types of projects that they will recognize as for developing your carbon offsets and thereby creating the credits, right? So there's, most of it is typically a program that utilizes deferred harvests off your land or improved forest management. And so you have to think about the amount of time that you will need to commit to that program. And certainly there's going to be certain eligibility requirements primarily in terms of the amount of acreage that is involved. And every program will follow a different standard determined by the registries that you would be registering your project with. So when we look at the different registries, typically here in the US, we look at the Verified Carbon Standard, the American Carbon Registry, and then primarily out in the Western US, it's going to be the California Air Resources Board. So the carbon offset registries, they develop standardized protocols for your project registration. It's by which they then can issue those carbon credits. They keep track of those credits in the marketplace and make sure that the environmental benefits associated with the individual credits aren't being allocated to multiple entities. In other words, obviously, if a greenhouse gas emitter has purchased credits that were resulting from the offsets that your forest created, that credit then belongs to that purchaser, and other people can't purchase the same credits and so forth. So it's their job then to turn these carbon offsets that you have into marketable credits, right? So the questions that you need to think about in exploring the different types of carbon projects that you could possibly enter, right? You have to think about what is the required commitment period in a contract. How long are you going to be obligated in that program? Certainly the costs. What are the costs of developing a project and managing its obligations throughout the project life? And obviously, one of the important things is what are the offset volume and price trends now and in the future that would make that project that you enter into profitable or not, and therefore how much how will the payments be handled? What's going to be the payment schedule to you as a landowner? And another important question, right, is how does that project fit in with your current and future management objectives? Including, the harvesting deferments, what might be some other management restrictions that you were contemplating, et cetera. And so basically, how well does that forest carbon program fit best within your current situation and land ownership goals, right? So those are going to be some of the things that you will have to think about and consider when listening to what some of the speakers have to say regarding these carbon markets. So thank you for the time, and I did it in 10 minutes, Kathy.
All right, thanks, Roger. I'm going to just jump in there, everybody, and do my share here. I'll be quick as well. Hopefully that's sharing the correct screens. That look good, Roger?
Yeah.
We were just on there. Okay, perfect. Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to talk more about sort of the economics of this. Roger kind of already showed these slides. The stress I want to make um, on this slide is really that what's what a lot of people out there trying to do right now is to create a commodity. So they're trying to create a commodity, much like corn, soybeans, something else. This one's a little bit different because it represents, carbon that you would store in your forest, in the soils in your forest, in the trees in your forest, or something like that, right? So it's a little bit different. It's not like a lumber that comes off of your forest and out into the marketplace. It still remains in your forest. So it's a commodity, but it's a little bit different than the typical commodity that we think about. We have a lot of people involved. Roger went through this perfectly. Super interesting to see how he thinks about it. I think I look at it exactly the same way, that these are all the people who are involved. I mean, the one thing that Roger didn't mention, I think, is that there are verifiers that ultimately, even if you have someone who develops a project on your land, ultimately someone has to verify that project. That's usually a third party. So there may be a third party involved. Not that they necessarily will come out to your forest, but they're going to be involved in the paperwork somehow associated with your forest. So lots of people sort of involved in this market. And it's a growing number of people sort of by the day, both on the buyer side and on the developer side. Um, some terms to know. You'll hear these terms. I just want to sort of go through them, and they're really important. So additionality is one, and additionality is the concept that your tons need to be storage that would not have otherwise happened. So oftentimes, the big limitation for people getting carbon credits out there in forestry is that a buyer won't buy them because they can't verify that you have created that carbon in your forest as something different than your business as usual, right? So if your business as usual is that you have trees that are growing on your land that are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, that's awesome. Everybody loves you, but no one's going to pay for that carbon because it's considered to be non-additional. And so this is the example we have in the U.S. And it's really crazy the way we think of this additionality standard in the market. So in the U.S., forests, and this blue line is the best line I can think of for what's happened in forests in the U.S. since the early part of the last century. Forests have been sucking enormous amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere all during the last century. The amount that they suck out of the atmosphere has increased over time. It's now somewhere between 800 and a billion tons of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere per year by forests. All of that because it's happening without carbon markets, it's happening without government incentives, uh, is non-additional. So that carbon is great. It's reversing some of the damages caused by carbon dioxide emissions from our driving our cars or from electricity production or whatever, but you can't pay for it. You can't use it as an offset because it's happening anyway. So that's kind of the penultimate example of additionality. And it's a problem, right? It's a $40 billion problem in my word. If we value that carbon at $50 a ton, which is what the social cost of carbon could be, that's a $40 billion problem. That is, landowners are doing a good deed for America and for the world and have no ability to get paid for that because it's non additional. All right. Nothing we can do about it. The standards are set to sort of say that that can't be additional, but just to keep in mind that this is, why sometimes if you're trying to do a project and you think you have the opportunity on your land, you may not be able to in the end because of this additionality problem. Two other terms, permanence and leakage. Permanence just speaks to the fact that you as a landowner having carbon, you recognize this. Your future carbon is not 100% guaranteed to be there, right? So if you're putting carbon on your landscape, avoiding an emission or paying offsetting an emission in the energy sector, it's plausible that a forest fire comes through your land at some point in the future, an act of God of something, a windstorm, all kinds of things could happen that could mean that carbon is no longer there on the landscape. And so that's a worry, and that's why some of the tons in forestry are going to be devalued because of this potential impermanence. Leakage is another one. It happens more often in, say, these improved forest managements, the deferred harvest things. So the issue there is that if you're deferring your harvest, does somebody else make up that harvest deferral, and therefore the carbon you sequestered because you deferred your harvest is then emitted by somebody else? So that's considered leakage. That can be quantified and accounted for in the transactions, but also devalues the transactions. So all these things, additionality, permanence, and leakage, their primary effect in the carbon marketplace is to essentially devalue the potential value you could get from carbon on your forest. So just keep that in mind. These are things that are really important and could have an influence on. And when you're talking to someone who might be thinking about providing you with or helping you get access to carbon money, these things might be preventing you from getting as much as you might think you could have. Okay, how big is the voluntary carbon market in terms of value? In 2023, it was down considerably from what it was in 2021, 2022, down to about $700 million. That's still a significant value. This is globally, this isn't just the US. So it's a big number. You know, a lot of these transactions are with US companies because US companies are really the only companies buying these offsets globally. But they could be for projects happening in any part of the world. The other side, the price number is really low, right? So this is what's happened in markets. If you're ever interested in prices, here's two websites to go to where you can get a pretty immediate take on current prices. This is the NGO CBL Nature-Based Global Offset. It's a futures market. It's a pretty good indicator of the current price, not just the futures price as well. It's a good way to sort of get information on where we are with this. And what you can see in this market is in 2022, prices were relatively high, $18 to $20 a ton. There's lots of excitement in the US about the potential for climate mitigation policy to proceed in the US. That quickly dissipated when it was recognized that we weren't going to put any new regulations in place that would force companies to buy offsets like this. So prices went down pretty quickly, and they've been low ever since. So what we know in this market is there's a huge supply, the big number of offsets that are out there that could be supplied to the market, and demand has been kind of slow to pick those up. And there's also some people just sitting on them out there as well because they're looking at a future where they think prices are going to be a little bit higher. But when someone comes out to your landscape and says, they're going to pay you 36 or 40 cents a ton, that's a realistic price right now. That's kind of where we are today. So one of the things I do on the side in my day job is I do actual projections of these carbon offset prices. So this is just kind of a big picture projection for 10 years. On the left-hand side, this is kind of where we think the voluntary market demand side for carbon could range sort of somewhere in this gray area. And that would lead to prices over the next 10 years in this gray area over here. So they could go up a bit. This would be a significant increase. This gets up to about $6 a ton by 2035. So not a huge number, not like it was in 2022, but it could be bigger than what it is today, which is 36 or 40 cents a ton. The high end, it could get up to about $19 a ton in our projection. So that's kind of where we are with what we think is going to happen with carbon prices. So just something to think about. There could be some appreciation there, but there also could be some real stagnation in these prices. This really high number would represent a crazy scenario of huge adoption by companies in the private market. I don't see that at all. That's a low confidence. I mean, I would put the confidence on that at 0.1%, really low probability of that happening in the next decade. Okay, so why so much price variation? And there's lots of worries about additionality, not just of Vera credits, but of all the different organizations' credits. That's the big one out there. There are still a huge number of credits. If you go into the Berkeley data set and you look at the number of credits that have been retired versus the number that have already been sort of put onto the market by the registries, there's a huge amount that are out there that have not been retired. So I actually have updated our analysis to recently, actually. And so frankly, it keeps getting bigger. There is variation in credit type. So what's crazy is that credits here in Ohio are devalued relative to things like cook stoves. So that we see companies out there seeking offsets that have to do more with improved sustainability objectives in other countries than sustainability objectives here. So it's kind of an interesting bifurcation in the market, which has caused prices for things that happen in, say, Africa to be a little bit higher than they are here. So it's kind of surprising, but it's happening. SBTI, one of the big sort of organizations that tracking voluntary market participation by companies, they're not currently allowing offsetting. So that's kind of pushed prices down. And then Article 6 refers to the Paris Agreement. That's sort of a global trading agreement. It keeps moving forward, but it sort of fits and steps forward, backwards, et cetera. So it's not really fully embraced. So this is why there's so much variation. Love to take questions on that at the end. Happy to chat about that a little bit more. Anyone wants to email me, feel free to email me. I did tell Kathy, I'm apologizing, but a little bit of shameless sort of self-promotion. doing a webinar in January on our new book, Reversing Deforestation, How Market Forces and Local Ownership Are Saving Forests in Latin America. So it's not about the US, although there's a great chapter in this book, chapter 5, which is predominantly about the US and the US story, which is an important one for people around the world to know. So welcome to that one if you'd like. I'm going to turn it off now for that and introduce our next speaker. If I can stop the share. Tammy Cushing. I'm really, really pleased that we have Tammy with us today. Look, when I think of taxes and forests and in-depth knowledge of both, there's really only one person I can think of, and it's Tammy Cushing, right? This is someone who has studied this, both forestry and the tax system in depth for a long time. And so, Tammy, we're really delighted to have you here with us today. You're at the University of Florida, and you before that, I mean, you were at Oregon State, right? Before that, Oregon State, you were also at Clemson. And I believe you actually did your degree at the University of Georgia, right? Your PhD at the University of Georgia. Okay,
Yeah.
that's okay. It's all right. It's good. Okay, this is great. So thanks a lot for joining us today. The time is yours. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me today. And I'm going to see if I can flawlessly switch this over. So hold our breath. Are we looking good?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to do my best on this. And when I say that, I want to make it really clear up front that there's a whole lot we don't know. But I'm going to try to dive into some of the tax implications and kind of what we think about what's going on and how we think about it. So view this as kind of a way of hearing how somebody thinks about tax law and different problems, because that's really what this is probably going to sound like. Sure, there we go. So I'm going to put up a bunch of disclaimers up front. Tax law is really complex, so I'm going to do my best to provide an overview. It might leave you with some questions, more questions than answers maybe, especially since there are some topics within this that are like whole conversations on their own within tax law. So this is obviously educational in nature. This is me protecting myself. The information is as current as I can get it as of today. The carbon programs are evolving. So Roger brought up NCX. They are no longer offering a carbon program. And so that was something that's changed within the last, I'm not even sure how long ago it was. It's not super long ago, but they're not in the game anymore. And so what I'm going to try to present is how it fits in with the ones that I know about and the ones that we're hearing about, but recognizing that they're constantly changing how they're doing it and they're not sharing their contracts with most of us. And I've tried. And then I will tell you that despite so many attempts, I cannot get answers. I am privileged to sit in a group of extension folks, everybody's ag but me, that all of us think about taxes, and we go and talk to the Joint Committee on Taxation every year. We talk to the House Committee on Ag and Natural Resources and the Senate, same group in the Senate. And every year I'm asking the same question. Well, what can you tell me about carbon income? And it turns into an educational program, kind of like what Brent just laid out, of what are the words, what's actually going on. So Brent and Roger's presentation together is kind of what I'm doing in about 5 minutes in front of legislative aides and such to try to explain even what carbon is. So if they don't know, the IRS doesn't really know, I won't say it's going underneath the radar, but it's not something they're addressing. And then if we dig a little bit deeper and we go down at the state level, I would say that's probably even less on the radar at the state level, because you're talking about public servants that are working for maybe the property tax offices. And I'm going to touch on some diving I did into the property tax, but the states don't really even know what's going on in a lot of cases. And so they're not putting these pieces together to see the implications. All right, so I don't have to cover this slide because Roger did a fabulous job of kind of showing you how this looks as far as getting into it and kind of the life cycles. This is a very generalized life cycle of getting in, doing some measurements, figuring out credits. What I want to point out on this slide, though, is that you see the credits determined, and then later you see that there's an agreement, and some point in there's a payment. That's going to be one of the questions that I'm going to leave you with today, is how many transactions are happening within this. So when I start thinking about any unknown income or any income unknown expense and how it might be treated, right? The tax code doesn't explicitly say this is how we're going to treat timber, right? It beats around it, and you have to understand the kind of asset timber is in order to put the tax code to it. So when we look at carbon, or in my world, when we look at pine straw, we're trying to see how does this fit in to the principles of taxation that are laid out within the income tax code. And so that's where these questions are coming from, is me trying to take this new thing and slot it in with everything else that I know. So I have a tax degree, but I also have a forestry degree. And so in tax school, we're taught to ask some of these things, like, is income taxable, right? So that would be a question we would ask about carbon. If we're getting paid, is it taxable? When is it taxable? Now that matters, right? Because you want to know, is it taxable in one tax year or another? Can I spread it out? What happens if I spread it out? How is it taxed? Is it ordinary income? Is it capital gains income? And that matters as well, because there are different taxes that start tripping in there, right? Self-employment tax comes in at some places. It's different rates. What do we do about all the expenses? Some of these programs, you are having to pay some expenses. And then is there something that I'm forgetting? Like, what other things are out there? So I'm going to walk you through kind of how I'm processing and trying to answer these questions. So is income taxable? First day of tax school, one of the things we talk about is what's the definition of income? And that definition is really coming from the IRS. And here's the language. All income from whatever source derived is taxable income unless, and the unless is a large laundry list, but basically what we're looking for is language, some provision within the code that allows me not to include it as income, right? So that's kind of a little bit different than what we normally think of. We normally think of, I want to know if I have to, and I'm telling you to think about everything as starting of, I got money, it's going to be taxable unless I can find a reason where I don't have to, okay? So this also includes, and this is where it gets kind of dark, increases in wealth, which is kind of a little frightening. So what that is saying technically is that if you have anything that increases your wealth, you should be paying taxes on it. Now, a lot of us don't do that, and we don't think that way. And I'm telling you that it is potentially a problem if you were to get caught. So where this comes in is things like bartering, right? Where you do something for your neighbor, you do, okay, I do tax returns. I don't, but I prepare tax returns. So I do my neighbor's tax return for them for free. And in turn, because he's a painter, he comes in and he paints my house. No money exchanged hands, but both of us actually have an increase in our wealth because of that. So that's kind of where some of that thinking is. So at the end of the day, the answer to that first question is yes, it's taxable. So I can say with certainty that the carbon income is going to be taxable. That's great. That's a really first important thing to know. Now, where you put it and how you treat it is going to be the difference between paying too much taxes or potentially not paying enough when you should have paid more. And that's where it gets a little bit harder. So this was the easy question out of all of this. The next question is, when is the income or wealth realized? And so that's a great question. And where we start not being sure is we have all these different carbon programs and they're operating a little bit differently. So we're trying to figure out what is the timing. And so we looked at some rulings. There's a U.S. District Court ruling called Roseland Plantation versus U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And this was really trying to figure out what was an owner's bundle of rights. And if that sounds familiar to you, we talk about that in conservation easements, about having a bundle of rights. And so that bundle of rights is you own the land, you also own the airspace above it to a certain degree, right? And then you own usually the mineral rights underneath it. And then you own the right to do the things on it, right? That bundle of rights unimpeded would be like your development rights, the right to sell the timber, the right to recreate on it, all those kind of things. And then, of course, there are things that might restrict that, right? Local zoning, rules like that. Okay, So the U.S. District Court in this Roseland ruling looked at a bundle of rights and said that carbon was within the bundle of ownership rights. Now that's important because in order for something in order for us to determine kind of the tax consequences of getting carbon income, we have to understand if it's real property or if it's personal property. And if it is part of the bundle of rights of the land, then it would be real property, meaning it's not severable from the land, right? And so that would be an important distinction. And so that ruling said that carbon was part of the bundle of rights, and therefore it was determined to be real property. Great, ding, ding. We like that. Then we have these REITs. And so the REITs were asking for information because REITs operate under real estate investment trusts, operate under very specific tax rules and things, that the amount of money they have to distribute and whatnot, and the kinds of activities they're allowed to engage in. So they asked the IRS for a ruling about this carbon income as well, because they were trying to make sure it wasn't violating their rules. And within this, they actually wound up with two rulings. So they went to a ruling and they were told that it was that it was real property, which confirmed what we heard in Roseland. And then a higher authority came back and said, you know what, it's not real property. And the reason it's not real property is that you can sell that carbon credit separate from selling the land. Now, that makes sense to everybody on here, but you got to think about timing of this. This was earlier before everybody was talking about it. And so the court or the authorities actually coming and saying, hey, this is separate from the land. It can be severed from the land, means it is no longer considered an interest in real property. So that was kind of a real important benchmark. And that was the more frequent ruling. So that seems to be the direction we're going, is that it is considered personal property, not real property. That's going to matter for tax characterization. And then finally, the thing that we have that looks most like carbon is sulfur emissions. And so for a while there, they were trading sulfur emissions. And so there were rulings and case law that we could find related to sulfur emissions. And it said within that the entirety of issuing a credit and then selling it was considered one taxable event, not two. That's an important thing for us to know. Sulfur was operating differently than carbon is operating, though. So that caveat there, that even though it's similar to it, it was different in that the government was primarily engaged in those sulfur emission markets, sulfur emission payments, versus now we're talking private entities engaged in it for carbon. They also said within that particular documentation that the sulfur credits were considered capital unless they were considered inventory specifically. Now that's really confusing, but it's different markets, and so trying to figure out what that means. So the consensus as we start looking backwards at all these different things was that there's potentially two taxable events, and this is really concerning. What it means is when you get issued a credit, when an entity says you have 500 credits, 500 carbon credits, that's been issued to you as a landowner, and that's probably a ridiculous number, I don't know. But when they issue you that credit, that would be a taxable event. And then when you sell the credits, that would be a second taxable event. So that sounds well and good when I pull it apart that way. But the reality is most of these programs are operating with a single organization with a simultaneous issue of a credit and then selling it, right? So in some cases, the landowner never even has their hands on the credit. And so did you have the credit issued to you in order to have a taxable event? Or did it all kind of happen in one fluid moment that it was issued and bought by the entity giving it to you? So, and then of course we have aggregators. These are these kind of middlemen that are pulling things together. All of that complicates that kind of timing of whether there's one or two. And so where I'm at on this particular issue, and this is probably not very satisfactory to you, is you have to read the wording in the contract. When you're signing these agreements on carbon, what does the contract say? What does the transaction actually look like? Because if you get into a situation with the IRS and an auditor, that's what they're going to do. They're going to look at that agreement. Maybe they're going to understand it, but they're going to look at that agreement and they're going to try to pull that apart and see what is really going on here. It is more than what you want it to look like. It's what do they really think is happening. Most tax law, what they're looking for is you doing something with a purpose that is other than changing your tax situation, right? So you don't want to structure a transaction just to get a better tax situation. The IRS would look at that and say, you only did that for that reason. And they would kind of nullify it and they go their own direction. So these contracts really need to reflect what's actually going on. So ultimately, there is no one right answer on when the income is realized, that increase in wealth. And that's not very satisfying for me, and I'm sure it isn't for you. So all of this kind of rolls into then how is the income taxed? And so just briefly, there's two different kinds of income that we are faced with here in the US, right? Our ordinary income, that's your day job, your wages, and then capital gains. And so the difference between these two really comes down to rates. That's one of the big things, right? Capital gains get a better tax rate, a lower tax rate for most individuals. That is, in most cases, what our timber should be taxed at. Hopefully you're aware of that. If not, we probably should do a different webinar. Your ordinary income would be, in my world, like pine straw generation, or if you have a hunting lease, that's ordinary income. And so again, they get different rates. And then you have an ability to offset gains and losses that are the same in nature. So I can take capital losses and offset capital gains without limit. I can take ordinary income and ordinary losses and offset with no limits. But when I have ordinary and capital and try to offset, there's a $3,000 limit to that offset. So that's important to know if you have a lot of capital gains or you have a lot of capital losses and you're trying to use those. You want those things to be of the same characterization. And then, of course, and I said this a little bit earlier, the self-employment tax. If you have income that goes in as ordinary from selling your timber, that would, in most cases, be a mistake. If it got characterized that way and you otherwise qualified for capital gains, you also have the privilege of paying 15.3% in self-employment tax. That's not good, right? That's extra tax that you're paying on top of it. So if carbon payment income goes in as ordinary income, you're going to pay a higher rate, up to 39.7% currently, and you're going to pay a 15.3% self-employment tax on top of it, right? And then we can argue some other taxes that could come in as well, the net investment income tax. So there are all kinds of consequences to ordinary income. That's why I'm so concerned with this characterization question. Why I care about when that income comes into you, when it's actually realized, is because your holding period is what allows you to qualify for capital gains. So to qualify for capital gains, you have to hold the asset a year before you sell it. So if it's deemed to be that you only had it for a year or under a year, then it's going to be ordinary income. You're going to hit that self-employment tax. So back to the carbon transactions. If we go through and we say it's 2 transactions, the credit is issued to you, and then when it's sold, you likely between issuance and sale date are less than a year, which would mean that the income from the sale of the credit would likely not qualify, even if it otherwise would have qualified for capital gains. Starting to catch my drift on why this is getting problematic. We also look at how you're holding the timber, why you're holding the timber, why you would be holding the carbon credit. That's what I'm looking for. If it's primarily for sale, so this is easier to talk about with timber, right? If I hold the timber primarily for sale, so it's my business and it's I'm just selling timber constantly, then we would normally call that ordinary income because it's inventory. So the way this translates over to carbon is if I would say if you held the timber primarily for sale, like as a business, then that would be ordinary. If you held the timber, the underlying timber that the carbon credit is based off of as an investor, investors, as long as they hold it a year, qualify for capital gains treatment on the timber. And so likely we could say that that carbon that came from that timber, that carbon credit coming from that timber asset held for at least a year, the credit at least a year, could be capital gains. If you're paying attention, you're hearing me say could. Because again, we're trying to infer from all these other things that we know. We're not getting a ruling. We're not getting any answers from anybody that does this officially, unfortunately. All right, so there's more. It depends. There's so many reasons that all this stuff depends, right? So with no federal guidance, I don't have any clear answers. That is not a happy place for somebody who really likes to have clarity. Maybe I should have chosen a different profession. Tax law does not have a whole lot of clarity. There's a lot of it depends, and we are definitely in an emerging area with a lot of it depends. So I could start looking at other things like maybe an easement. I could throw an easement test at it. So giving up or signing into these carbon programs really is kind of giving up a right. So really a lot of times we're giving up the right to maybe harvest completely, right? So I can harvest maybe some, but I can't harvest all, or I can't develop it, right? Which makes it sound a little bit like an easement, right? So does it give it the right for an extended period of time? That smells like an easement to me. Okay? So if we have a long-term one, and I'll go with the California one, California, the market out there is a 100-year contract plus some for monitoring. That's an extended period of time. If I was to sign on to something like that, I would say that I've given up a right for an extended period of time. So to me, that kind of sounds like something that is an easement. And when I give up an easement, we have the ability to kind of think about that. If you were paid for that, I would say that was kind of capital in nature. If it appears to be more like a short-term rental, okay, so I give up the right for a short period of time to do something, somebody comes out, I can't use my property completely because I'm allowing somebody else to do it, and they're paying me on an annual basis, but it's short-term. What is short-term? When NCX was still around, 1 year was short-term. We now have programs that are 20 years. I'm not sure. I think that is getting longer term. I don't know if I would call it short term, and complicating it is whether they're paying you annually, right? So those annual payments are what throws a kink in some of this for my brain. If I look at the like I said, the short-term carbon contract and what NCX was offering, it was a 1-year contract. It was akin to a short-term rental. And I would have said that was ordinary income. And NCX agreed. NCX sent out what's a 1099 and called it rent. So when they called it rent, that's pretty much what it was. If I look again at that 20-year midterm kind of length carbon contract, I think it could possibly be a capital gain income. Again, kind of depends on wording within the contract. I haven't actually seen that 20-year contract that one of the organizations has out there. But that organization has a very different type of program, which is, I'll try to bring that up a little bit later. Then we can look at, again, that long-term contract like California, the 100 years, likely equivalent to an easement or sale of an interest, right? Because long-term, you have given up that. And I would consider that capital gain income. So if by some means we could get some legislative body to give us a ruling somehow, whether it's a legislative body or a judicial body or a letter ruling that said carbon was real property, I would feel better about just kind of almost blanket giving it capital gains treatment, almost. All right, so now that I told you I don't really have any answers, great answers on the income, let me back up half a second on the income. I would also say that if I was in that carbon program out in California, I think I would go ahead and think about running it as capital gains and seeing if you could get the IRS to give an answer on it. There was a landowner I met that had actually filed it as ordinary income and then was talking about maybe going back and amending it. They had already paid the taxes on it at ordinary income rates. And so there really was nothing for them to be jeopardized by submitting an amended return and asking for a refund, claiming that it should have been filed as capital gains. It would have kind of pushed the issue. I'm unclear if that landowner has followed through. There was a lot of money at stake. So moving into kind of the expense side. So there are 3 ways generally in the tax code we're handling expenses. I can subtract it from my proceeds. Think about a timber harvest. If I do a timber harvest and I pay the logger, I can subtract those logging expenses right off of my timber income and show my net gain to go into the tax and then start working with the other provisions. I can deduct it immediately. That would be something like here in the South, we do fertilization. So a fertilizer expense, the code allows us to deduct the fertilizer expense. So if I fertilize in 2024, when I go to do my tax return in 2025 on my 2024 return, I would deduct that amount immediately. And then finally, I could capitalize my expenses. So if I was to put seedlings in the ground, so I do reforestation, those reforestation related expenses, barring using some other provision, all those expenses would be capitalized or added to my basis. Again, that's a different conversation, but basically I'm holding on to those expenses mentally until such time as I start harvesting timber, and then I would start recovering proportionally those expenses. So those are 3 ways I handle my expenses. So the deduction is going to reduce my income and result in a tax benefit equal to the expense times my tax rate. And then the capitalized expenses are added to the basis and used later to reduce my gain. Okay, and I kind of give you a description here what basis is. This is basically what you paid for something or what you're in it for. All right, so if I apply this now to carbon, what do I do with it? I'm going to break it into what these expenses actually are. So the first one I would say is the kind of the exploratory expenses. You're thinking about it. They want you to have a cruise done on the property specifically to kind of figure out what carbon might already be out there being sequestered and what trees are out there so that they can calculate the amount of carbon sequestration potential you have in front of you. So if you go through with that, and you have any expenses on that front end, kind of getting signed up, and then you do not sign the agreement. You decide it's not enough. I don't like the terms and conditions. The payment's no good. Something changes and you don't do it, you would deduct those exploratory expenses right away. If you have expenses associated with enrollment, so I do go ahead and I sign that agreement, it becomes part of the cost basis. And again, those expenses that go into my cost basis, I do not get to recover those expenses until such time as I sell the timber or sell the land with the timber on it. And then there are methodologies for recovering that. If I have expenses that are directly related to the sale of the carbon, then I'm going to subtract that from sale expenses. That sounds just like what we would do with timber. So that part's pretty established, pretty easy to understand. So I've said this a couple times already, so apologies. The basis is recovered when the asset is sold. And so this is where it gets interesting. If we look at whether I have 2 events or 1 event, if the receipt of credits, so the organization says, here's how many credits you have, and if we determine that that's a taxable event, at that point, you're just going to recover the expenses associated with it, and whatever's left is the gain on that sale. The basis in the credits now, right, because you would have a basis in those newly generated credits until you go to sell them, that basis is the fair market value of those issued credits. That's what you got at that point in time. And then when you subsequently sell those credits to, let's say, a different organization, then your gain is the difference between the sale price and that fair market value when the credit was issued. And I think that's what I just said. When the credits are sold, the basis is recovered as the income is received and taxed. So it's kind of like depletion on timber. All right. So the other question I asked on the front end was like, what else should I consider? And you can never forget about state income taxes. Ohio has a state income tax. We do not here in Florida. But there are a couple different ways that income taxes work in relation to the state income, sorry, the federal income tax. So some states piggyback, which means they link to some particular part of the federal income tax code, right? So they go and they decide, you see on here, that some of them link to the taxable income. So you do all of that work on your federal income tax return. You calculate your taxable income and your state links right to that point. They say, okay, take that number, we're going to start from there, and then they're going to make maybe some potential positive and negative adjustments to that. Sometimes it's the adjusted gross income. So 31 of the states use the federal itemized deductions. Others do not. Right now, we know that there's some issues with the itemized. I'm not aware of what Ohio does, and so maybe as we get to the questions, somebody can clue us in on that. There's also states that do standalone. They don't use the federal return as any kind of starting point. So what I would say to you, whether your land is in Ohio or a neighboring state, maybe you are a snowbird and you have some land down here in Florida, so it doesn't matter, check. Look at the state and figure out where it's starting, because that's going to matter for kind of how this carbon is playing in and how they're going to view it. Because if they come in late into the federal income tax, then they're just going to do whatever the federal income tax is doing with it, which you've seen we're not even clear of. All right, so let's move over into property tax. And, you know, a lot of times this is something we weren't thinking about, and then somebody asked a question about it to me one day. And we have these programs that allow us not to have our property taxed at fair market value, or what it would sell for if Walmart wanted it, right? So these programs come in and they reduce in some form or fashion the value of the land for property tax purposes, or they have a lower rate, or they have, I think Indiana has a set amount that they tax per acre. And so the question was whether those programs, which are all trying to keep the land in forests, whether they conflict with what's going on with carbon, which is a great question. So some of the programs have harvest and management restrictions in them. So they say you have to have a management plan. Some go further and say you must be in it for timber production, and anything that stops timber production would be in direct conflict with this property tax program, which is why we're bringing it up here. So I did a quick look of these three programs. I'm going to kind of go quick through them because it's not Ohio, but I want to kind of give you an idea of some of the potential trip ups that we're having with the property tax and carbon. So North Carolina, I picked that because I knew that they had some kind of language in there about what was required as far as forestry production. So they use a present use value for forestry purposes. And it's based solely on its ability to produce income from timber growth, assuming an average level of management. Okay, so some of these carbon programs require some kind of management, so that would be fine. The language here does not say timber production at this point. Minimum 20 acres in timber production. So the tax officials review the objectives of the landowner to make sure, here's where it comes in, that commercial timber production is the primary goal. So the management plan would need to say that commercial timber production was important. And then I think the question would become, is carbon going to allow you, are you going to be allowed to get in the carbon programs if your management plan says that timber production is your primary goal? And so it's, again, what are each of these organizations looking for, and will they play nice with each other? Common reasons for disqualification in North Carolina included that the landowner was unwilling to follow the recommendations in the management plan, especially pertaining to harvesting of timber. So the landowner had a forester write him a management plan. In it, it says primarily for timber production, and that they're going to harvest in 5 years. And then they get in the carbon program and they don't make a change to that program language within their management plan. They're going to be going against what their management plan says. That would get them kicked out in North Carolina. So if the property is disqualified, it's a rollback provision. This is where these things get dangerous, right? If you get kicked out of your property tax program, what they do is they actually are going to make you pay some of the taxes that you saved in prior years. So we'll go to Vermont, our northern state in this look at it. And they're really trying to do long-term management, and they want it to be working forests. And so they've made a really big point about that in Vermont. So their language is that it has to be managed productively. All woodlands enrolled in current use must have a management plan that includes harvesting timber. But they specifically say it doesn't have to be an annual harvest. So I think that kind of language can be very helpful for these carbon programs. You have to management plan updated every 10 years. I want you to see that other objectives, wildlife, aesthetics, recreation, watershed, they're acceptable objectives when consistent with and complementary to timber management. And so this would be writing that management plan showing that carbon is complementary to timber management. I think in a state like Vermont, where we have longer lived, we're more hardwoods, that could be much easier to do versus somewhere like North Carolina, where you start getting more into pine domination. So the key here is Vermont has other programs. And so you see that if the landowner chooses not to harvest trees, they become ineligible unless they were enrolled in this other program, which is more of an environmental stewardship program. And then Oregon. So Oregon was why I kind of went down this path. Was I suspected that there were going to be some problems in Oregon. Oregon has two programs. One of them is for land that does not automatically qualify as forest land. And so they've gone through in their land use and they've said this is forest land, whether you're using it that way or not. And then other acres are not in that program, and they would have to ask for an assessor to come out and allow them to qualify into that program. That second program is significantly better from a property tax standpoint, but it comes with lots of provisions attached to it, including a severance tax, because they're deferring so much of their tax under that second program. It is only for smaller landowners. But in that smaller program, that deferral program, it has to be timber production. And so let me see if I can find that. When the designation of forest land is removed and additional tax is extended, the county assessor has a lot of power in this case. They can disqualify lands that don't continue to meet the standards of the program. And that's going to create extra taxes. So one of the questions on the enrollment form for this program is any portion of the land subject to a lease, option, or easement, which permits it to be used for a purpose other than growing and harvesting of trees. And the question is whether carbon gets into that restriction on the harvesting of trees. I called Oregon and I tried to talk to some folks in the property tax assessment office at the state level. And like I said with the IRS, they did not know what I was talking about with regards to these carbon programs. And I tried not to dig because I didn't want to kind of alert this program to kind of what might be going on when there's so much uncertainty. So I walked away from that one. Right now, I would say most of these programs are not really alert to what's going on. But if we have filing of deed restrictions, anything that would be filed formally, that could come to the alert of the assessor. So property tax program is kind of my bottom line on these. You need to know what program you're in. I know Ohio probably has a program. Most states do. If you're in other states, look at the program you're in. Try to understand before signing a carbon contract, talk to the assessor. Say, hey, if I did this, you know, what would that mean? Would that have any implications for my property tax? Know that this is evolving for them as well. These are not necessarily people that are in forestry. They're dealing with all kinds of land classifications. And so while this is something we're talking about, that's not necessarily something they're talking about. So it's evolving. They may give you an answer one day, and scary enough, it may be a different answer 2 weeks later. A complete restriction on harvest, I think, is going to result in removal from some of the programs, because that is not what they want. They want to know that you're deferring it, and that at some point you're going to harvest and you're going to pay the tax as appropriate. So One thing I would tell you is that if you're talking to some of these carbon programs, convey any concerns you have to them. They're trying to learn, if they're operating in 50 states, clearly they're not going to know exactly what's going on within these property tax offices in every one of the states. It's complicated. I've tried to learn it. It is very complicated. So if you're giving feedback to these programs, I think that's going to be the most useful thing to them. So kind of to sum up tax implications and what I know, what I think, what I am certain about, and this is a short list, is that carbon payments are taxable. Okay. If you do that and you put it in as ordinary income, you're not going to get any pushback. That I'm fairly certain of. That's going to cause you the most taxes of any of the other alternatives from a federal standpoint. What I'm not certain on is whether there's one or two taxable events. And again, that goes back to that contract language and how each of them is structuring. I know some are structuring some small payments along the way with a big balloon kind of payment at the end. I made some vague reference to the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy Program. It's a family carbon program. There's a letter missing there. Family Forest Carbon Program, something along those lines. That is a very different structured program. It almost smells like cost share to me, where they're giving you funds in order to do certain things on your property, and then they're paying you to do that, and then they hold the carbon credits. So I'm not even really sure that most of this applies to them. But again, I haven't seen a contract from them or an agreement. I've been unable to secure one of those. I don't know if it's ordinary capital gains because it depends on timing. It depends on whether it's one or two events. It just depends. And then I don't really know the impact on the property tax programs that are focused on timber. I think that's going to evolve. I think right now it's okay, but you should read. I would say to stay tuned, and maybe we'll get some answers, but don't hold your breath. Every May I have an opportunity to ask the question yet again from some of our federal legislators in the House and the Senate and in the Joint Committee. But every year I am seeing different people. That is just kind of the nature of the beast, that you can have a conversation and educate, and then there's turnover and you're once again trying to educate. All you can hope is that they're having those conversations after they talk to you. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. This is something that while people that are getting payments are concerned about it, this is not the biggest concern of most people who are doing policy conversations on forest landowners' behalf. This is just not what they're concerned about. They're concerned about casualty losses, and they're concerned about keeping all these other tax provisions. This is just not the topic of the conversation, which is unfortunate. It means we're not going to have answers anytime soon. So don't hold your breath. And with that, that is the end of the fire hose that I have for you today. And I'm handing it off to somebody else, and we'll have time for questions in a bit.
All right. Thank you, Tammy. Lots of info. Don't forget, if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A box. But I'm going to keep us moving so we can try to stay on time. So up next is Stephanie Downs. Stephanie is with the Ohio Division of Forestry and is going to talk about some of those land issues we were just talking a little bit about with like CAUV and that. So Stephanie, go for it.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, I'm going to build on what Tammy just talked about and go a little bit more in detail about some of the implications with one of Ohio's property tax programs. So Ohio actually has two property tax programs. Sorry, my computer's not working. So currently we have two tax programs for property taxes for woodlands in Ohio. One of those is the current agricultural use value, or CAUV, which a lot of forest landowners are enrolled in. This program is administered by our county auditor's office. So each county runs a little bit different within the state guidelines. And this is not one that I'm going to focus on today because it's not a program that Division of Forestry administers. We work with our county auditor's office and help with some of the advice on the program, but it's not one that we have control over. So this one, the basics that I'm going to give you is real simple here. Talk to your county auditor's office. If you're interested in a carbon market program, The implications may vary depending on what county you are in within Ohio. So this is one where you're going to want to talk to that office and figure out what their requirements are specifically, and if there are any implications on your restrictions you may have with a carbon market program. What I'm going to focus on today is actually the Ohio Forest Tax Law. So this program is administered by us with the Division of Forestry, and we have statewide rules and requirements that we're going to touch on some of the things you should consider if you're enrolled in this program or thinking of enrolling, and also looking at some of the carbon market programs out there. The Ohio Forest Tax Law is designed to provide a property tax savings for working woodlands and keeping them as working woodlands. So it is a 50% reduction on your property taxes for your wooded acres that are qualifying, and that's basically meeting Ohio Revised Code's definition of forest land. And in return for that tax savings, those enrolled landowners are agreeing to manage for the production of timber and other forest products. So those requirements for Ohio Forest Tax Law is that you have to have a minimum of 10 acres of forest land. This excludes all of your buildings and openings. So there's some exemptions within that, but in general, it's going to exclude your buildings and your openings. And the purpose is growing, managing, and harvesting a merchantable forest product of commercial species. So this is limiting it for timber production. So we're looking at that timber production of commercial species at some point during the management of the property. There is a requirement for what qualifies as forest land. So you have to have at least 50 square feet of basal area per acre, or at least 300 stems per acre of younger forests that are commercial species. So those species that can be sold as a timber product down the road. And management must be allowed to meet the purpose. This is where you cannot have a restriction that does not allow you to harvest timber off of your property. So if there is a restriction for timber harvesting, then you're not eligible for Ohio Forest Tax Law. And some of that comes into whether or not you're looking at the short term or the long term with some of these carbon programs. And if you're deferring, does that mean you're not managing for timber? We're going to come back to that when we get there. Other requirements for Ohio Forest Tax Law, you do have to have your property boundaries marked, and you have to have an approved forest management plan. The forest management plan has to include acceptable silvicultural systems. So by this, I mean any forest management activity that is accepted by the forestry community as being sustainable and good for the future. So your management plan within OFTL is basically a written document that sets up what are your goals and objectives, how are you going to meet them, what is out on the property, and lines out a schedule of activities, things that you should do in your woods to meet your goals and objectives and improve it for the future. For the tax program, it must be written by a professional consulting forester. So that is actually defined by law, and it's a Society of American Foresters certified forester. So they would have a CF after their name in signatures, an Association of Consulting Foresters member, or if they are not either of the first two, they can receive training from the Division of Forestry and be added to a chief's list, which allows them to write plans for this tax program. The management plan has to be active. So all management plans have an expiration date. They have to be either rewritten or a new plan has to be obtained when those expire. So they do have to be active on the property. Some of the things to keep in mind. So if you're in Ohio Forest Tax Law or you're applying to be in the program and you're looking at some of these carbon markets, you have to be able to manage the forest for the production of merchantable forest products. So there can't be restrictions on managing your property for timber. You have to be able to follow the forest management plan for your woods. So if there is an activity in your forest management plan that would not be allowed under your contract for a carbon program, you could have issues with your tax law eligibility. You must be able to follow all harvesting recommendations in the management plan. And this isn't just being allowed to harvest or not. It's being allowed to conduct the harvest that is recommended in your plan. So some harvests would be allowed under certain carbon programs because it's meeting their guidelines and you're not taking out more than what they're allowing you to take in your woods. Other harvest methods may be required to regenerate what you want or to meet your objectives, but it removes too much volume to qualify for your carbon program. And so it's not a yes or no answer. It's also what exactly is recommended and does it comply with all of the requirements in both programs to be eligible for both. You have to have that plan written by an approved consulting forester. And I throw this in there because some of the carbon markets offer a management plan as part of the enrollment in the program. Not all of the people writing those plans meet our legal definition of a consulting forester to write those plans. So if you're interested in Ohio Forest Tax Law, you may not be able to have the carbon market professional write your management plan and have it qualify for Ohio Forest Tax Law. So you have to make sure the person writing that plan meets our list of professionals. And then again, you have to be able to follow those recommendations within your management plan. So some things to consider here is if you're looking at these options, do you already have a management plan? If you do, what's in it? So what's being recommended? What are you required to follow to remain eligible for your tax program? And what are you allowed or not allowed to do according to the carbon contract that you may be looking at? If there is a harvest recommended in your plan, how much is being required to be taken out? And how does that affect eligibility for a carbon program? And then what other management practices? Not all cutting is just harvesting. If you have a lot of invasive species like tree of heaven, sometimes that's included in the carbon calculation and you're not allowed to remove it past a certain point. And so you have to look at that contract and what you're allowed to take out versus what you should be taking out in your woods outside of a timber perspective as well. Are you looking to put in trails? Is that going to include removing trees or carbon from your forest? Are you looking to put in wildlife openings? There's a lot of different management activities that aren't the sale of timber that could also be impacted by the requirements in a carbon program. And so all of these need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at whether or not that program is right for you and your forest and what you want your forest to be in the future. You should also take a look at when your management plan expires. Because when it expires, you're probably going to have different recommendations for the next 10-year period. And so consider those next 10 years as well, because your carbon program is probably going to exceed your management plan active dates. And so what's going to be needed for the next round of your management planning if you're still enrolled in that carbon program? If you don't have a plan, how are you going to get it? Who's going to write it? Consider your options on paying for plans and hiring a professional to get that plan done. And keep in mind that in order to qualify for Ohio Forest Tax Law, that management plan is reviewed by your state service forester and approved as eligible for Ohio Forest Tax Law. So the ultimate say in whether or not a management plan is acceptable for the program falls to the Division of Forestry and our state service foresters. So talk with your service forester, get some ideas on what they think would work, what might not work, what's in your plan, and how to move forward with that. The other thing to really consider is what are your goals? So why do you own your forest? And not just now, but long term. What do you want 20 years down the road when this contract length may go to, or 40 years, depending on what program you're in? Consider what you do. Do you harvest firewood? So I know on our forest land, we harvest firewood and that's how we heat our house in the winter. And so we have to consider how much wood do we need to remove to heat our house versus how much wood are we allowed to remove for any of these carbon programs, and what would the cost be in buying the additional firewood that we would not be allowed to harvest off of our property? Do you have forest health concerns? So we've seen oak wilt pop up in a lot of different places across the state. Is this something that's on your property, and are you going to have to control that? Because that might make some of those acres ineligible for a carbon market if you actually control the forest health issue that's there. Are you looking for wildlife or recreation or other, management goals? And how do these tie in with producing timber long-term down the road? Do you need some early successional habitat or openings for your wildlife habitat management? How does that fit? One of the big ones we've seen some concern about is, are you looking to restore oak-dominated forests, especially Southeast Ohio? A lot of initiatives, and one of our priorities for the state when it comes to forest management across the board is helping to restore some of these oak-dominated forests that aren't replacing themselves. Most of the management required to restore an oak-dominated forest removes more volume than what some of these carbon programs allow. And so by enrolling in a carbon program, you may limit your options for how you long-term manage your woods and what type of regeneration forest you get in the future. And it's really just looking at what do you want, short-term and long-term. What are your goals? How do you need to get there? And does this program fit with what I want for my property? So really, you should be looking at all of the different pieces. Review your management plan, review the regulations and requirements for your tax program, and review all of the requirements and restrictions that may be in a contract for a carbon market. Take them all together, look at whether or not they work together as they are and work together in the future. Consider all of your goals, consider all of your objectives and what would be allowed versus not allowed. Assess your invasive plant situation. So if you want to manage long-term for healthy forest and you have invasive plants, you need to make sure you're allowed to control those under any program that you sign up for or get a contract with. And then what types of management are and are not allowed. This is going to vary depending on what program you're going on, and it may vary over time as these carbon programs evolve and change. So basically looking at that contract period. If you're looking at a carbon program, how long is that contract? What do you need to do during that time frame in your woods to meet your goals and objectives, to follow your management plan, and to remain eligible for Ohio Forest Tax Law, and consider if it fits or not. Seek advice, get opinions, talk to your service forester, talk to your county auditor, talk to your professional forester if you have one, and see what some of those limitations and considerations for your property are. So in conclusion, Ohio Forest Tax Law and carbon market programs can work together, but we can't guarantee it because it's going to be a forest by forest basis. It's going to include looking at your management plan, what's recommended, and whether or not you can still meet the objectives of that plan. Before you sign a contract, we're recommending you talk to your service forester and see what those implications could be for your property. Figure out the potential issues and conflicts before they come up so that you don't have unexpected consequences down the road. Review that forest management plan. Make sure you know what's in it. Make sure you know what's required, what's recommended, and what you're going to have to do in your woods down the road. Then compare them to those contract requirements and make sure they work together. In the end, a loss of the ability to manage your forest, as laid out in your forest management plan, will result in removal from Ohio Forest Tax Law. So Ohio Forest Tax Law does not have the recoupment, so the back taxes. So you wouldn't have to pay those back, but you have to consider the additional taxes that you're going to pay moving forward and how that compares to the rates that you're getting for the carbon program and whether or not it works out for you financially. That's all I have for this. I think at this point, going back to Kathy.
Yep. So we have one more speaker for today. I have Beck Swab from Holden Arbor. I'm going to say Holden Arboretum back because that's what I'm used to saying. But I'm going to turn this over to you and give you the screen, and then we'll get to questions.
Hi, thanks for introducing. I don't have slides, so I don't necessarily see the screen as much, but yeah, I'm just going to talk real quick. Yeah, so thanks for including me in this, Kathy, and thanks everyone for speaking. I learned a lot about tax law and things like that today. So I just wanted to talk quickly about, so we're Holden Forest and Gardens, but that consists of Holden Arboretum, which is outside Cleveland, and then Cleveland Botanical Garden. And at Holden Arboretum, some of you might be familiar with, we have Working Woods Demonstration Forest, which is a forest that's set up with different forest management techniques. We did a single tree selection harvest. We have unharvested areas. We have areas we've done invasive species removal and thinning. And we have landowner field days. You can come and kind of see side by side what these different management techniques might look like. And recently we got a grant from the U.S. Forest Service for specifically to help us hire some consulting foresters and outreach coordinators so that we can help folks enroll into carbon markets specifically is kind of the goal, the larger goal of the grant. And so if anyone that is in Northeast Ohio specifically wants to connect with us to help with those, I'm going to put some links into the chat so that you can fill out our form. We have one consulting forester hired already, and we have another one we'll be hiring soon. So we won't be ready to go out into landowner properties until the spring. But the plan is that we can help with things like writing forest management plans and other things, steps that you need to do to get enrolled into the carbon markets for anyone within probably about an hour drive of us. And if you're further afield, you could still potentially sign up for our mailing list because we have educational programs. You can come and see around a variety of different topics. We'll have some related to carbon markets, but other things as well, just like how to manage your forests in different ways. Some online potentially, a lot more in-person types of things. Like we had like a woodworking workshop last year, or sometimes we have a variety of different classes and things like that too. So I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. One is for if you're interested in signing up to be on our list so that we can mail you out when we have the consulting foresters ready to go out to land. And then another is just a link to one of our resources, which is our small woodland management manual. And that can help you walk through for your particular forest, kind of what are your goals, what are you looking to do that can help you make some decisions. We don't have yet, but we will probably change soon. The carbon market is a very large part of that manual, but it can still help make some decisions and help you figure out what first steps you need to do if you don't know what to do to manage your forest. Yep, so that's all I have today. I'll put those links in the chat and feel free to send me messages or ask questions too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So with that, I'm gonna open it up. Let's see, I don't see anything in the Q&A, but it looks like in the chat. So Beck, there's a question for you. Is the outreach opportunity only available for Northeast Ohio? If so, and current project is successful, might you apply for another grant and extend to Southeast Ohio?
Yeah, so the our consulting foresters are only for Northeast Ohio within driving distances. Some of our outreach, we do plan to extend beyond Northeast Ohio, especially with partners. You know, we might go down and coordinate with a partner to come down and do some, outreach educational workshops in person, other places in the state as well. We're going to start in Northeast Ohio though and kind of expand out from there. But we'll definitely have virtual kind of programming and things like that occasionally as well that would be available for anyone that's anywhere.
Okay.
Hey, Kathy, I had a question for Tammy, if I can. Tammy, as we enter a new sort of 4-year term, new Congress, do you sense any changes in tax policy coming forward? I mean, there's big changes in taxes the last time Trump was president, so I hear that there's some discussion of things, but would any of this have an implication for either forest landowners or carbon, either way?
Yeah, that's a great question, and somebody's already forced me to kind of prognosticate on that one. So, I think with his election, a lot of those changes were meant to sunset from his last administration. They were meant to sunset at the end of 2025. The expectation is that he will probably extend, or if not make permanent, most of them. I think there may be a couple that maybe he's gotten feedback that aren't so good for whoever he's listening to. I know I saw prior to the election that the bill, something like $4 billion if all of that was made permanent. So I don't know if that will result in it not being made permanent or a better look at it. I don't know that any of it's going to impact carbon. That's why I just don't think we're going to get any guidance from this particular administration or this particular set of lobbyists or legislators. I don't think it's going to be top of their priority. They're going to have to look at the tax code in 2025, but it may just be kicking some things down the road and extending things.
And I'm wondering if I can follow up a little bit on that. I know there's a Q&A, so Kathy, you can maybe cue that up. But Tammy, on the I was surprised, Adam Degno and I had done a study on sort of taxes with our global timber model, and I was amazed at the effect that the federal tax code could have through investments, the way investments in forests are treated, and could have on sort of investments in forestry. I mean, do you see the same thing in some of your own research? I mean, does the federal tax do you sense the same thing that little shifts in that can have a big effect on how people sort of manage their land?
I think people think it does, but I'm not seeing any evidence that people actually are like the property tax, if we're gonna be honest, is where people usually grumble and we see differences in how people manage. Not so much for for the income tax, because I don't think they're aware 9 times out of 10 of some of the nuances. And, you know, if you change this, it'll work, you know, or like I tell my students, if all you learn from me is about the reforestation tax credit, so that you can look at a landowner who harvests their timber and say, hey, I know you're thinking about not reforesting, but if you do, you can deduct up to $10,000 worth of reforestation expenses. If that's all I can get in the back pocket of a forester to help somebody reforest that might not have. So I think the bigger fear could be that we lose some of those big provisions, and that would potentially change it, right? If they went into tax code and they took away that reforestation incentive, the people that know about it, it might be the difference, you know. If we lost capital gains treatment of timber income, which is something that we're just being granted, that could be a big problem. I think that could potentially have a land use implication.
Okay, so we have some questions kind of mixed and mingled. Let me do, Rodney asks, would a harvest followed immediately by entry into a carbon program result in more potential credits based on a newer, younger forest?
I don't know who wants to tackle that one, but I know that I think maybe Roger was talking about the different types of programs, the improved management versus avoided conversion. I do know that some programs are working on afforestation and reforestation, but I think that's not quite as far along as my understanding. You know, obviously it's harder to get it motivation, right? Would you have actually done it? And so is it actually additionality, which is the argument that I've heard, that, you know, if you harvested it and you had it there before, you were probably going to replant anyway. You could say you weren't to get in the program, but were you really? And I think that's where we get some trouble with the additionality question on the the reforestation. Afforestation is a little bit easier. And so the company that I know was doing it was actually buying ag land, and then they were putting trees in the ground, which is afforestation. That would be additionality. So that's all I got.
I can jump in. I think it also depends on the program, because I know the family forest carbon program, you have to have a minimum basal area per acre. So if it's completely harvested prior to, you would not be eligible for enrollment.
Okay.
The other thing would be on that is if you were normally going to harvest and replant, if that was your normal intention, then that would not qualify, right? Because that you would have to demonstrate that what you are doing is above and beyond what your normal operations are. Because that, you know, if you cut and then replanted, right, that if that was what you were going to do anyway, then that would create a problem, because, you know, that's, you're not adding anymore to the whole carbon paper towel out there sucking in that carbon. You're not adding anything more, because that's what you were going to do anyway.
Okay. Marnie, you said you had some questions that had been emailed to you. Do you want to take one of those and then we'll?
Yep. So Steve, these are from Steve Reeser. I don't think he's on the chat, but he sent these a while ago. He said, our farm has 2 separate woodlands, one 20 acres and one 50 acres. Can you contract for carbon capture for one, but not the other? Or would the management easement necessarily extend to the entire farm?
Well, I could jump in on that. You could. It's just going to depend on who you're going to contract with, right? So it really is going to be a program dependent decision. And then if you look at the Vera protocol, for example, it's an improved forest management, then you're going to have some leakage provisions in there. And so one of the reasons why you might want to do it all is because, they might, you might have to do something on the other part anyways to manage the leakage in order to keep the leakage haircut, which is a reduction in the credits you're going to get. It could help keep it down. So it might actually be in your interest to put all of it in rather than just part of it. So, I mean, all those really they're so context dependent on the programs and the actual protocol that you're using. It's kind of hard to answer that, but the short answer is yes, you can, but you might have a better opportunity to do it all. So I don't know, Tammy, you might have some other thoughts on that.
No, all I was going to say was, several of the programs require you to put your entire ownership in, and it is about the leakage issue, right? So we tend to think about that being a big question as well. So if you only put one parcel in and you just harvest heavier on the other one.
Okay, I have one here. How does all of this apply to a nonprofit that holds land precisely in order to protect it in perpetuity? Are we not eligible to join the carbon market?
Well, that was one of the famous articles, I think, in Bloomberg, where they took to task the Nature Conservancy for some carbon credits that they had put on the market. Because they're an organization whose basic task is to protect and preserve land, right? They do it pragmatically, oftentimes by doing timber harvest and things like that in certain places where it makes sense. So yeah, that's a big question. It's kind of an open question, actually, for people who have that. The general answer is probably no. Probably you can't get the carbon credits from that because it's non-additional. But I don't think that's where the Nature Conservancy has come out. And I think there's still a lot of debate and discussion on that. So I don't think the final answer is written on that. So, keep tuned. It's kind of like tax code though, Tammy, right? I mean, this is all evolving and things could, next year something different could happen. I did notice that Weyerhaeuser, this is another one. Joe Weyerhaeuser, if you're a timber company whose job is to produce timber and you're making timber, you also aren't producing additionality, right? Because you're going to have those trees for timber purposes, and even if they're on net sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, you can't sell those according to the additionality police. But Weyerhaeuser has gone ahead and got a couple of things through with Vera. I think I forget, it might have been ACR actually, and so that's also on the buyers, right? So if Weyerhaeuser can find buyers for those credits and the buyers can convince their people who are buying their products that these are good, legitimate credits, then it's basically okay. So this is all sort of an influx area.
Marnie, do you have another one?
Yeah, the other questions are all on activity that can take place if he were to enter an easement. So he's asking about hunting, if that is permitted, cutting dead trees, and grapevine removal and work.
I think the low hanging fruit's the hunting. I mean, like, that shouldn't be an issue. Any of the removal of stuff, it's a function of how it was measured. And I'm not a measurements person, but I think Stephanie said it best. It's what was included in the measurements. If they've included grapevine, then probably you shouldn't be removing it, right? So I think it just depends on whatever's been measured and understanding that, and that may differ depending on the models they're using.
It would also and that would fall under, improved forest management. You would have to, if the grapevines were included, as Tammy was pointed out, that's one thing. But if removing that resulted in an increase in growth, then it's possible that could be included, right? If you're so here's the thing, forests inherently, that's what they do, is they sequester and store carbon. That's what they do. That's part of their function. So what we look at is, what are you doing in management to enhance what the forests are already doing? We know forests store carbon, great. But what can we do to increase that storage? And that's really what they look at. So in any kind of timber stand improvement, it would depend, right? It would depend on what you are removing, what was previously counted, and then what is the outcome of that in terms of the enhanced carbon increase that you get in the forest. So removing dead trees could also be included, right? Because dead trees, even though they're not really taking up resources, they are taking up space. And thereby it sort of removes some of the resources, i.e. sunlight, growing space, and so forth. So even removing dead trees could be counted, but that's going to be determined by how the carbon is measured in a large part.
Okay. Gary Valrath wants to know, Tammy, how well versed do you think the average CPA tax accountant is to handle carbon issues?
Gary, I could extend that question, say, how well do I think the average CPA tax accountant is to handle forestry issues? It's a mixed bag. So the average, if we go just the average, they don't know most of the tax provisions that apply to forestry, and they don't know enough about the asset class itself to even apply what they know about tax law appropriately, right? So we see mistakes like timber harvest income being miscategorized as ordinary income. We see people instead of when they reforest, instead of taking the reforestation incentive, the tax preparer says you have to capitalize it, and that is a mistake that can't be amended, right? So there are a lot of people that just don't know that, and that's not their fault. I don't know a lot of things either, right? And so this is going to be even worse. I mean, like they're going to have to dig. I've approached a couple of accounting firms. I'm trying to get an article together with one here in Florida to kind of just dig and like do what I just did with you all in a written format and get it into something that accountants read and let them have at it, right? Like let them just trash it if they need to. But maybe some of them will learn and think about a little bit of how this asset works and how the carbon is layered into this conversation. So long-winded way of saying, I think you're going to have to be explaining things to your accountant about what you've done. And they may need to see the contract. If I was doing it, I would ask to see the contract. Even with my background, I would say, let me see your contract. Let me see the agreement so I understand what you have agreed to and what it actually means. And I think most qualified CPAs, tax preparers should ask for that. If you go in and do it on the tax programs online, they don't ask the right questions to handle carbon payments. So, but these carbon programs are sending paperwork out, right? If you get paid more than X amount of dollars, you get a form. That form is going to dictate how you categorize it. It may not be right, though, is the problem, because when I talk to the programs, they're guessing as well. And sometimes they're just going the safe bet, which is ordinary income. So I wish I had better news. That's why I have to keep doing this over and over, hoping I catch more people. Advocate for yourself.
Okay, so the next question. Oliver asks, of the carbon firms you listed on an earlier slide from Roger Williams, are they all reputable? All these grins, guys, come on.
I quite honestly, I can't attest to all of them being reputable because I've never quite honestly dealt with them directly. I don't know if Tammy or Brent have, but I know the Family Forest Carbon Program is pretty reputable. That's the only one that I've ever had any kind of dealings with. I don't know if Brent or Tammy can, or Stephanie.
Well, NCX was reputable. It was just a very different kind of program, especially with a 1-year term. And so there were a lot of questions about it. It was a great opportunity for people to get in the market, but that one has gone away. They had some trouble with some verification issues, like the methodology was not approved through Vera. And so they've gone a different route. They're no longer in that game. The other ones, there's a whole bunch of them. You know, ask your forester what they know. The forester hopefully has, you know, had some experience or has connections. That's the nice thing is we have our own professional networks. And so, you know, I can reach out to somebody and say, hey, have you heard of this? You know, have you done anything with this? What's been your experience with it? Even if it's a newer one. So.
Okay. Next question. Joe asks, do you know the difference between the approaches for eligibility prioritization utilized by the Family Forest Carbon Program versus Forest Carbon Works program for a smaller, approximately 50-acre managed woodland?
I can't answer that. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know prioritization. I know that they're, you know, like Forest Carbon Works, I think is they're trying to get down in the size. They've been operating on larger acreages just because of costs. So I know they're trying to drop that size amount, but their eligibility, I think, is fairly similar, but I don't know. Prioritization is a different question than eligibility. So I don't know that answer.
I don't know that one either. But yeah, Forest Carbon Works, they usually have a larger minimum acreage requirement than Family Forest Carbon Program.
And they operate very differently. The one is really more, Forest Carbon Works is really more your traditional carbon credit versus Family Forest Carbon Program is not.
Okay. Gary's follow-up to his accountant question says, I suspect the research required by the accountant would add considerably to the return preparation fee.
It could, but you want it done right.
Yep.
Unfortunately, though, I think they're going to do a lot of the same research that we've already tried to do and are still just kind of taking chances. So always ask yourself, how risk averse are you?
Okay, so I have one from Anonymous. Thanks for the great presentation. I'm sorry that I missed the first little bit of it, so I don't know if this was addressed already. Can you talk about the length of these contracts, the amount that's being paid to land/timber owners, and does this interfere with non-surface disturbing subsurface development of oil and gas? What kind of amounts of money are the feds setting aside for these programs?
Well, the last one is we don't know yet. We don't have a new farm bill. So, you know, there's currently not anything in the current farm bill. The new farm bill could, but we don't have one yet. So that's kind of to be determined. I haven't seen any huge programs in there that would be related to this, but and for the ones that are out there, they're mostly going to be related to doing it in soil carbons and things that happens on farms rather than in forests, as the typical farm bill does, right? It doesn't do a lot for forests. It does a lot for farms. So yeah, subsurface, I don't know, you know, Tammy, you could probably know more on that. My sense is that there, as long as it's not disturbing the above ground, there's no interaction there. So not much to worry about, but that's a great question. What was the first question on there, Kathy?
So can you talk about the length of these contracts, the amount that's being paid to land/timber owners?
Well, I don't know the exact amounts being paid. They're all over the board on that, as far as I could tell, and the contract length is as well. But I'm just gonna make one point: is if you look at that price projection I made, you can see what every one of these organizations is doing. Is they are paying higher than the current price. The current futures price is around 60 cents, 30 to 60 cents a ton, which is minuscule. And so, lots of people right now are sort of trying to they're basically creating credits
Oop.
and holding them in the hope that the price goes up. So there's a big shift for prices to go up. That can play out either way. That's why the futures price is so low, right? Is because a lot of people are saying we don't think demand's ever going to go up, and we've got this massive quantity of things out there. So I just urge caution on this to everybody that, you know, you might want to be the one who's holding the carbon credit. Like if I had the money, I would go out and develop the carbon credit myself and hold on to it. And sort of take the risk on it since it's my own land, right? I don't have that kind of money to do that, but I would kind of do that. That's what I would do is I'd figure out a way to hold that rather than have someone pay me $3 a ton so that in the future they can get $20 a ton, right? So that's just a thought. And given that it's an asset you're already holding, and you can do a lot of other fun things on that land anyways, like all the hunting and riding of four-wheel drives and things like that that people love to do on these properties, then have at it, right? So I think there's lots of benefit and opportunity there, but just don't expect to make much money on this for now.
What I would add is, the length and the amount are kind of tied together a little bit, right? So the longer contracts, the ones out west in California, those pay a lot better. You're in it for the long haul though. And because of rules and regulations out in California, there is a different kind of market for it. There are people that need to buy into it versus the voluntary market. And so that compliance market gets a better price, but it has a lot more rules and a longer time period. So that's 100 years plus the monitoring. The lowest one I know that exists out there right now is like 20 years, and they don't pay near as much.
Okay. And this one's for Brent. They want a connection info for the AEDE 122 webinar on carbon in Latin America. Do you have a URL? You could pop it into the chat if you want.
Yep, I'll do that here in a second.
Okay. Ken asks, he says, I have 5 acres that was a cornfield 20 years ago. I've planted about 300 trees on about 3 acres. My take of your presentation is I'm not eligible for any carbon credits.
Can you repeat that?
Go ahead, Brent.
It says, I have 5 acres that was a cornfield 20 years ago. I have planted about 300 trees on about 3 acres. My take of your presentation is I'm not eligible for any carbon credits. So he's planted trees on about 3 acres of that former cornfield.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, there's going to be a minimum acreage size that you will encounter. That will be a problem. The other thing will be is that, and it's going to vary by program, but there's also going to be a minimum density or basal area that has to satisfy. So it would, yeah, it sounds like your 3 acres of 300 trees, which obviously 100 trees the acre, the basal area will probably be okay, but the problem that you will have is the area of the land that you are talking about that would be considered.
Okay, so we have one left. Carlene says, could Tammy repeat that? See, I lied. Someone added a question. Could Tammy repeat what she said toward the end about Family Forest Carbon Program? I understood her to say that what she'd said prior in the presentation didn't apply to FFCP as it is a type of cost share.
Yeah. So Carlene, my read on what I hear, and that's the best I have. I've not seen a contract. I've not seen an agreement despite asking for it. And like I said, none of them are sharing it. So it's not just them. Is that the way they're doing it is you don't actually own the carbon credit. So they're doing all their assessment and they are paying you to do a particular operation on your property. Maybe it's invasive species removal, it's fuel reduction, whatever it is. So they're paying you to do something that would improve the property, that would give them, I think, an increase in their carbon credits that would be applicable for the property, but they don't actually issue you the carbon credit is what I understand. And that I want to go back to something Brent said that was brilliant about like developing it himself and sitting there and holding it and waiting for it to go up. That's what I think AFF is doing, is they develop the credit, they hold the credit, and they'll sell the credit when it makes the most sense for them to sell the credit, so they can then use that to continue to give money to forest landowners to do things on their property. That's my understanding from what I've heard and gathered from people, but I have yet to see any agreement that says differently. So it doesn't qualify as cost share because cost share is a very, very specific thing with the federal government. So I would not say it's going to qualify for like cost share exclusion. I would say it may just flat out be income. And unfortunately, that would smell like ordinary income to me if they're just giving you money to do something.
Okay.
Probably another unsatisfactory answer from me. A wealth of non-answers.
So Mark asks, under Family Forest Carbon Program, any news on FFCP increasing the current total 5 cords of firewood permitted to be removed per year for 30 to 199 acre woodlands? I'll stop there because he's got another question. Nobody's got any news on that?
Don't know.
Okay, so also, are you hearing any rumblings about FFCP lightening up on the required pre and post harvest forest inventory requirements to reduce forester inventory costs that reduce carbon credit payment benefits? Some landowners are weighing this particular cost benefit as they consider FFCP.
I can't imagine anybody lightening up on pre and post harvest inventory requirements. They do a lot of homework when they put those in place. And it's about providing reassurance to the verifiers and ultimately the people that buy the credits. So that's my gut on it anyway, but that's not an informed statement. That is an interpretation.
Okay.
I'll just wait one quick comment on that. I totally agree on that. Like that, there are so many people looking at this market to fail that if for instance they did lighten up on that and someone went out and some reporter went out and saw some people doing some things that were untoward and causing carbon emissions, that would be a disaster. So I kind of agree with Tammy. Just it would be, it'd be interesting to see see them take that approach because there are so many eyes on this market.
There's already that scathing article from New England that from one of the big companies, landowner companies, that said, yeah, we played in this market, we made a lot of money, and we did nothing different. And everybody saw it. So yeah, lots of eyes. You're right, Brent.
Okay. Rodney asks, probably to Stephanie, but anyone can chime in. Crop tree release program. Crop tree release, it seems to me, allows better growing of crop trees at the expense of less desirable trees. So wouldn't there be an argument that CTR activities are a net no loss activity, i.e. no loss in carbon credit? Thoughts?
I can start on that. So I'm going to also tie this to invasive plant removal because these are two things that I've asked about and tried to find research on to support arguments for allowing, and I've run into some issues. So crop tree release, you're picking the better species, right? So they're going to put on more carbon on the better species. They're going to store it longer in most cases. Yes, you are removing trees, but you're also increasing growth rates of other trees. There's a lot that goes into the calculations, but you've also removed volume, which is removing carbon. And part of the problem we run into is how long does it take to get that back? So what is the time frame to reach net zero again? And how long are these programs looking at? So invasive plant control, sometimes it's a lot of volume that's removed. And the initial calculation is you've resulted in net loss of carbon. But if you take it out long enough, you've put enough growth on trees that you've equaled that no net loss or have actually exceeded what it would have been otherwise. But there isn't the research over that time frame to show where that is and how much additionality or no net loss, like where do you reach that? So if anyone has research on that, I'm looking for it, I will take it. But it's one of those challenges we face with some of even the climate smart practices through programs like NRCS programs.
Well, I'm just gonna, to me, that's a perfect example of the deficiency in the additionality standard. So the idea is the person has a bunch of trees that grew on their property and suck carbon out of the atmosphere for the last 30 years, and they got no credit for that. Then they decide to take a few of those trees out and try to get increased growth on some remaining trees. So they're kind of, going up and up and up, then they kind of come down here and then they're going back up again. So what's happening is we're making our carbon evaluation right now at this period when right here, right, rather than anything before that, right? That's the additionality problem is they've been, they can't count that, right? And so that's that's a strict standard, and that's the standard we live in the world we live in. There's nothing you can do about it, but I'm just pointing that out, that this is, you know, people are out there in the policy world that they can do something about that, right? They can actually make the definition better and more appropriate, because the reality is that forest land did suck carbon out for a considerable period of time for which it got no credit. And so anyways, just think about that. I mean, everything that's neither here nor there. What Stephanie, you said is totally agree with, but you know, I just wish that we could deal with this addition now, this strict standard, and get some flexibility on that.
Well, I think that's part of what AFF, the Family Forest Carbon Program, was actually aiming for, right? Was to set a baseline based on your neighbors, right? So what is going on in the area, and if you're above that. So they were trying to make the case for that. Unfortunately, the way it's structured, you know, the landowner themselves doesn't actually see that change benefiting them in that credit because of the way they're structured right now. But that could change too. It could all change.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop recording.